Outpost 2, Divided Destiny, Eden, Chapter 3, Accomplice. Axon didn't trust Book Fanati, but he found him to be useful, and for now, that was enough. Axon's traditional methods had depended on stealth, making small changes at key points to achieve large, long-term effects, and most of all, patience. Eden's current status disrupted all of that. Whatever the wind had set loose, it continued to advance unpredictably. The colony had been forced to relocate again, and it appeared it would not be the last time. The council had made a decision not to tax the colony's resources with a long and dangerous migration. Instead, they would move a shorter distance, dig in, build their resources, and hope for a solution. At least from here on out, any relocations would be planned and, to the degree possible, orderly. But that didn't help Axon much. Anything long-term was uncertain and subject to interruption. His method of manipulation and plotting didn't work. It was like trying to build a house of cards during a quake. Young Panatti's methods, on the other hand, were brash, quick, developed on the fly, and, Axon had to admit, better suited to the world as it stood. As a result, Axon not only used Panatti, he watched him, learned from him. Today, Axon sat in a corner of the crowded common area of the first new residence module constructed since Eden's last relocation, and observed the young man wheeling and dealing on the far side of the room. Panatti's blue eyes sparkled. His smile flashed like a dueling saber as he cajoled a short-haired blonde woman Axon recognized as one of the housing supervisors. They sat on a bench surrounded by adults and children, chattering, crying, working, reading, playing, most pointedly ignoring each other in the pretense that had come to serve them as a substitute for privacy. The woman was frowning, but although Axon was too far away to hear the conversation, he had the feeling that she was caving in. He had to admit that Panatti was as skilled with charm and salesmanship as Axon was with authority and logical persuasion. Axon's web of contacts, informants, and influences had been shattered by the disaster at Eden. Most of these had been among the older colonists, the first sons and daughters of Axon and his fellow elders, born in the frantic first few years after landing. They had been conceived in that honeymoon between the euphoria of surviving the voyage and the horror that the elders' lives were being cut short by hibernation syndrome. Axon had watched as that first generation, all his closest contemporaries, died around him. Only a handful, including Axon and Emma, were young enough and had been wakened early enough to escape the brunt of that terrible sickness. Now, he had watched most of another generation cut down before its time. It weighed heavily on him. He'd lost too many friends in that first tragedy, and he'd since considered friends a luxury he couldn't afford. Panatti represented another age group. Some of them the children of elders, some of them the following generation, but socially divided as though by a wall. This was the comfortable generation, which had grown up in an Eden that had become fat, happy, and fearless. For them, survival had never seemed an uncertainty. Want had never been their companion. Until the disaster. Until now. Axon had to admit that Panatti was well connected. In the aftermath of the disaster, evacuation, and relocation, he and his contemporaries had been pushed into positions of control and authority. While some would have become slaves to duty, or inversely, resentful of the burden, Panatti both shouldered the load and immediately saw the opportunities created. He'd maintained every contact available to him, and had used these to make more. Single-handedly, he'd created a black market in luxury goods and services, and made it so efficient and useful that the authorities were forced to look the other way. In his own way, Panatti provided a service that the struggling colony couldn't do without. Until his violent first meeting with Axon, those contacts had been used only in the cause of petty racketeering. but Axon had immediately seen more substantial possibilities. Even though Panatti had failed to deliver on his dubious promise to deliver Kraft back into his possession, in any case, the disruption of the latest evacuation had given them a reprieve in that offer. Across the room, the conversation seemed to be ending. The blonde woman glanced at Axon without making eye contact or acknowledging his presence, then stood and made her way out through the safety lock. Panatti, in turn, stood and strolled casually towards Axon. He sat down on the other end of the bench, pretending to be studying a form displayed on his clipcom. Axon glanced at him without moving his head. "Well?" Panatti smiled slightly. "It's a done deal. I shipped some schedules so she gets her next resident module 2 weeks early, and you've got room 13 over there," he motioned with his head towards the left wall. "You can move in anytime. I'll send a cargo cart down to pick up your stuff." Axon shook his head slightly. "Not just yet. Did you set up the meeting with your scientist friend?" "They're very busy getting the new lab up to speed. He's working double shifts." "Did you set up the meeting?" The corner of Panatti's mouth twitched down. "Yeah, but it cost me darned near as much trade value as getting you private quarters." "It doesn't matter. Kraft might be able to tell us something about what went wrong back in the hot lab. Failing that, we have to know what the authorities know." "They already told us. An advanced nuclear power source ran out of control and flooded the area with hard radiation." Axon smirked in spite of himself. "You believe that?" "What else would it be?" "I don't know, but I know what radiation poisoning looks like, and something else killed those people. Something chemical or biological." "You weren't there when the accident happened. How could you—" He looked over and abandoning the pretense of ignoring Axon. "You're keeping things from me again, aren't you?" "I tell you what you need to know. We talk to your friend, and then perhaps we'll both know what happened. When and where." "The maintenance tunnel under the CC in half an hour. Why can't we just meet in your quarters? I thought the whole point of arranging for them was to get privacy." Axon sighed. "Privacy that I don't want to compromise with visitors. I don't want to draw attention by having a constant stream of strangers going in and out of my room. I've told you time again and again that I don't want my associations to be that obvious." Panatti scratched his nose. Okay, I was just asking." "I saw you with Della again last night. That's the 3rd time this month." Panatti frowned and flexed his hands nervously. "We're drinking buddies these days, that's all. She might be useful if we're ever going to get your computer back." "I know that, but it doesn't pay to get too close." "I'll be the judge of that. Listen, we have a working relationship here. You just stay the frag out of my personal life. Understood?" Axon said nothing. He had denied himself companionship for far too long to have much sympathy for the younger man. He knew too well the problems such entanglements caused. His relationship with Emma had worked only because they had been in the conspiracy as equals. It had failed for the same reason. Panatti leaned forward half out of his seat. "I'll meet you down there in 20. Later." He stood and strolled out of the room as casually as he entered it, expertly hiding any anger he might be feeling. Axon slumped back in his seat and sighed again. He liked working alone, and resenting having to depend on this child. Panatti's motives were less than clear to Axon, and that made him uncomfortable. Axon could use him, but he couldn't trust him, and didn't know if he could depend on him. It was the kind of uncertainty that kept Axon awake at night. But for Axon's, there was no choice whatsoever. The tunnel was narrow, nearly identical to the one where he'd first met Panatti. It gave him a sense of deja vu. He'd even been here before, right after the relocation, to investigate the possibility of contacting Kraft. He could still see the scratches where he'd removed the service panel. Sloppy work, he thought. Panatti had been right, of course, and might have saved Axon from a terrible mistake. His plan, while it might have worked, had been far too risky, born more of desperation than reason. Patience had always been his forte, and in this one instance, it might still be the best plan. He glanced at the chrono display on his wrist link. Patience had its limits. Where were they? A pair of figures slid around the nearest bend of the corridor. One of them was Panatti, the other, a shorter man with a round face and skin the color of dark chocolate, had to be the scientist. Axon stared at Panatti. "You are late." "It's my fault, Elder," said the scientist. He stuck out his hand. "Eldon's the name. Eldon Jensen. You presented me a science award back in the 3rd grade. It's a real honor." Axon had a vague recollection of the school visit, before he'd become the last elder in Eden, and the burden of secrecy had fallen solely on him. Axon suppressed an annoyed smile. Evidently, it wasn't enough of an honor for Jensen to make the meeting without a substantial bribe. "So," continued Jensen, "what do you want to know?" Axon studied the man. He seemed guileless, but one could never be sure. Certainly, he had already proven himself greedy enough to be bought. "I trust you understand that absolute discretion is necessary here, Jensen. I don't want this conversation getting back to the Council, and anyone else for that matter." Jensen smiled. "Of course." Axon nodded. "Good. As you are certainly aware, Mr. Panatti and I are not without resources. If word were to get to leak, we'd be most upset." The pause was calculated. Sometimes a pause spoke terabytes. Jensen looked from Axon to Panatti nervously. Axon noticed that Panatti kept a perfect poker face. "You can count on me, completely." Axon smiled reassuringly. "Then we can move on. I want to know what went wrong at the hot lab. What killed all those people at Eden? And what is forcing us to keep moving?" And Jensen looked nervous. We don't know. Radiation." To Axon's surprise, Panatti shook his head. "Don't try to scam us, Jensen. We know those people weren't killed by radiation poisoning. Radiation wouldn't continue to spread. That's just a cover story for something maybe chemical, more likely biological." Jensen chewed his lip. "Biological. We know that much. Wynn had them working on a terraforming bug. It was supposed to live in the deep rocks to crack loose hydrogen and oxygen bound in the planet's crust. They were into some serious biotech beyond simple genetics. They were re-engineering the internal workings of bacterial cells from the molecules up. They thought they had it, too. They were confident enough to begin field tests." Axon nodded. "Test wells under the lab." "Those were the start, but they were doing field tests, too. A line of wells running up Jaeger Canyon, almost to Plymouth, following the natural fault line." A chill ran down Axon's back. Whatever happened could potentially have affected Plymouth as well. Then what went wrong? How did a terraforming bug destroy a lab and send us scurrying across the landscape like nomads? Jensen looked puzzled. "I assumed you knew, Elder. You were the one who pushed for the first evacuation of the colony. You mean you didn't even know why?" Axon frowned. This was exactly the sort of question he didn't want to raise. Panatti jumped in. "We brought you here to answer questions, Jensen, not to ask them. We've paid for the answers, not you. If the Elder asks that he already knows the answers to, it's because he needs to know what you, and in turn, the Council, think the answers are." Axon raised an eyebrow. "Good going, boy." Jensen took a moment to digest the response. It seemed to go down well. Without knowing the details of what the Wind's people were doing, and we don't, we can't say for sure. What we do know is that it has something to do with his terraforming bug, and it's reproducing and spreading through deep rock at a phenomenal rate. Along the way, it's causing geothermal activity in some way we don't understand yet. The tremors we've been feeling lately, said Axon. That's just one symptom of a much broader effect. Possibly that's what happened in the hot lab. A steam blowout through the well, or even magma. We just don't know. Jensen hesitated, as though he thought he might be saying too much. We've tried to send survey vehicles back into the contaminated area. They all malfunction and stop transmitting shortly after entering. The information we have suggests some breakdown of the organic materials in the vehicle. Plastics, bioamylants, and the boptronics, things like that. We think there may be a way to protect the vehicle, at least for a while, and we're working on a way to detect the approach of the bug. The Blight. That's what we've been calling it. It's about all we know at the moment. What we really need is to get back into Eden. So Jensen stared at Axon, blinking silently. It seemed there was nothing more forthcoming. I want to be kept posted on your progress. If there are any significant developments, contact Mr. Panatti at once. If necessary, we'll arrange another meeting. He considered his own words for a moment, then continued. Furthermore, I want you to arrange for me to be called in a consulting basis. Jensen blinked and bobbed his head nervously. What? Elder, I can't. Axon wasn't listening to him. Mr. Panatti won't make it worth your while, and there are plenty of legitimate reasons. I've got more hands-on boptronic experience than anyone, and I helped build the original Eden. I know everything about it, including plenty that you won't find on the blueprints. Jensen's eyes narrowed. I suppose I could at least suggest the idea. Don't suggest, Jensen. Push. Understand? Jensen nodded, and when it was apparent that they were through with him, he straightened and tried to put on a business face. It's been a pleasure, Elder. He stuck out his hand again. Axon ignored it this time. I'm not your friend, Jensen. I'm just somebody who is paying you for certain considerations. Remember that. Jensen quickly pulled back his hand, slid past Panatti, and departed without another word. Axon and Panatti watched him go, waiting until he'd been out of sight for several minutes. So, said Panatti, breaking the silence, what did you see during the disaster that told you this radiation thing was a cover story? Axon turned and started walking away. I heard a woman warning me of the danger with her last breath. He kept walking. I watched her melt into goo right in front of my eyes. Action stood in a darkened control room of the command center, studying the images flickering on a large screen. The link to the observer satellite had only recently been restored, and until now, access to it had been so restricted that Axon hadn't seen a single image. Now, his dealings with Jensen had finally borne fruit. It didn't bother Axon that the call had come at such a late hour. He knew he was a controversial figure, and they undoubtedly wanted to keep the meeting as low profile as possible. He noticed that most of the CC staff had been sent on break, though Panatti's friend, Della, was working on the far side of the room. Even she was careful to keep her eyes to herself, spending her slack moments looking out the large window behind her console rather than at them. Jensen was there, along with a few other scientists that Axon only knew in passing. He noticed that Jensen was standing at the far side of the group and was being careful not to make eye contact. He's not a good liar. Something I should have taken into consideration before I started this. Still, he seems to have pulled it off. On the screen, the same 1-minute satellite video played for the 5th time since he had arrived. Dr. Kolo addressed Axon. He was the senior of the scientists, a hard-featured man with a shaved head and bushy black eyebrows. Elder, we're consulting you on this matter because of your broad knowledge of boptronic systems. This video was taken from the Observer satellite about a week ago. What do you make of it? As he watched, a vehicle, one of Nguyen's combat units, lurched its way across the screen, pausing the fire at a cargo truck that had similarly lurched within range. Parts of the truck's cab glowed and melted under the combat unit's energy weapon, and the truck lurched once more before halting, perhaps forever. He looked Kolo squarely in the eye. I'd be glad to help if I can, but to be of much use, I need background. Tell me what really happened during the disaster. The scientists looked uncomfortably at one another. Then Kolo sighed and turned back to Axon. The situation was a great deal more serious than we've led people to believe, and the danger is not past. Not even our continued migrations have ended it. We know that some kind of biological agent was released in the lab explosion. Possibly was even the cause of it. That agent continues to spread deep underground in a manner we don't fully understand, seeping to the surface through vents where it can infect buildings and vehicles. That agent was an accelerated microbe, engineered from bacteria that had lived in hot springs, deep ocean vents, and buried in the crust of old Earth. Microbes that already could survive the most hostile conditions imaginable. That microbe was designed to live in New Terra's crust, breaking oxygen bonds, releasing water and gases to form a new atmosphere. But, interjected Axon, the human body is full of oxygen bonds. So are many of our plastics and synthetic materials. So are biological elements of our boptronic systems. The scientists again looked uncomfortable. He was telling them things they hadn't intended for him to know, just as well as his conclusions depended on that knowledge. Axon continued. What we're looking at here isn't a boptronic system anymore. It's an optronic system. From what you've told me, the protein computer cores of these units are gone. It's as though they've been given a skillful and selective lobotomy. Jensen looked at him. You think they're dangerous? Based on what you've shown me, I know they are. The combat units are, anyways. There may not be anything else left operational by the time you get there. These units have lost their higher command functions, their ability to understand responses to commands and to recognize other units, friends or foe. What's left are hardwired autonomous functions: move, steer, avoid, attack, patrol. My guess is they'll fire at anything that moves within range of them. Or, if erosion of plastic insulation is also causing shorts in their electronics, they could totally be unpredictable, capable of doing almost anything. The scientists looked at one another and moved off to the corner of the room and began talking in whispers. Axon hoped that they didn't give up on the idea of an expedition to the disaster site. It might well be their only hope of learning enough to control the Blight. Axon watched the attack on the truck again and wished there was a way to connect craft to the satellite station so he can attempt to contact Emma. Plymouth had to be warned if they had any hope of survival. They were in at least as much danger as Eden, perhaps more so, given their own ignorance. If they even still exist, he thought. He longed to redirect the satellite to check on Plymouth, but that wasn't possible. And if the scientists had already done so, the images were, like most other information these days, being suppressed. The scientists moved back over. Elder, said Dr. Kolo, we'd be grateful if you took to the video and materials we provided you and prepared a report for us, outlining the danger you think those rogue vehicles represent, and suggesting countermeasures. We'd also like your input on procedures to transfer data from the non-biological memory systems of the Eden lab computers. Kolo hesitated before continuing, long enough that Axon almost thought the conversation was over. There is another related matter. The digital backups of our gene banks were in that lab. It's possible that they've survived, and if so, we'd like to find a way to salvage the data. Axon's eyes widened. You don't mean we've lost our gene banks? Kolo smiled slightly. No, nothing like that. The 3 biological gene banks, human, agriculture, and biosphere, are still intact. In fact, they're stored here in the CC for safekeeping. But the digital encodings of those genes have always been our backup in case something ever happened to them, and we don't have either the time, the resources, or possibly even the technology to reproduce the data. Axon was aware of a spot to apply the leverage. Plymouth has their own copy of the biological gene banks. Kolo's face was blank as he responded. I don't see how that's any good to us. We aren't even sure Plymouth still exists. Oh, he's sure. He knows something about Plymouth that he isn't telling. If only I could get to that satellite downlink. But even the fact of Plymouth's survival or destruction was still denied to him. As he left the CC, he passed the parked scooters without stopping, deciding that the walk would help him think. He'd gone only 100 meters or so when he ran into Panatti. What are you doing here? Panatti frowned and looked away. Della's getting off shift, and she and I were going to play a game of billiards. Axon just shook his head. It's none of your fragging business, Axon. Just then, they heard a muffled boom, and the air around them seemed to surge towards the CC. Axon felt his ears pop. He was already looking for the nearest emergency suit locker when it was apparent that the pressure drop was a small and only momentary. Their fight forgotten, Panatti stared at Axon. What the frag was that? Pressure blowout, said Axon. He pointed towards the CC. That way. Panatti ran up the tunnel, and Axon trotted after him, following up the ramp towards the CC. As they watched, a cart with a volunteer emergency crew rolled past, stopping just in front of the sealed emergency lock. One member of the disaster instant response team checked the indicators on the lock, then flipped the override switch to open both doors. People began to stagger out, including Jensen and the scientist Axon had just been talking to, stunned looks on their faces. Panatti grabbed Jensen and pulled him aside. What happened up there? He stared blankly at Panatti for a moment. Brooke, sorry. I just made it out in time. My ears are ringing. I don't feel so good. Panatti put his hands on the man's shoulders. We'll find you a medic. What happened? Jensen put his hand over his mouth, fingers pointing upwards, touching his upper lip. Is my nose bleeding? Panatti gave him a little shake. What happened? Viewport blew out. Meteor hit, I'd guess. There was a crack and then it just blew. A woman was standing right next to it and was sucked out. Woman? What woman? Axon's jaw clenched. He already knew the answer. Jensen stared off into space blankly. Della. Her name was Della.